Before we get into the bulk of this review, I want to give a quick shout out to all the patrons and YouTube members. You guys keep the train chugging and I appreciate it. If you have any spare bucks to toss my way to support the channel, I would greatly appreciate it. All the money I've made so far has been immediately reinvested into the channel to make better content for you. I also want to remind you that we have a community Discord you can hit up to talk games, movies, music, and more. The link for that is down below. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to let me know your thoughts on the Super Mario RPG remake. Developed by Squaresoft in collaboration with Nintendo and originally released on the SNES in 1996, Super Mario RPG didn't exactly light the world on fire upon its release. Despite having a strong critical reception and hitting the market at a point where SNES ownership would have been at an all-time high, for some reason the stars just didn't align. Selling 1.5 million copies in Japan alone, the eastern side of the world was very keen on this approach to Mario. However, in the West, Super Mario RPG didn't even crack into the top 5 best-selling games of the year. But over the years, Super Mario RPG has slowly but surely become a beloved game in Nintendo's storied catalog. Mario RPG went from cult classic to just classic over the span of the last nearly 3 decades. But why? Why do people still talk about this game after all these years? Well, there's a few reasons for that. One is the developer. Hot off the releases of Final Fantasy IV, V, VI, and Chrono Trigger, Squaresoft had become the premier role-playing game developer of the time. Some might even pose the argument that Mario RPG is the best RPG that Square developed in the SNES era. The second reason the game still gets talked about is the originality it brought to the scene. You see, back in the SNES era, seeing Mario do something other than scrolling side to side and jumping was still a new thing. These days we take it for granted, since it feels like every other week there's a new Mario franchise spin-off, but back in 1996, Nintendo was still experimenting with how they could take Mario into new genres and experiences. The SNES was where we got the first Mario Kart, and Mario hadn't even played a sport yet. Well, unless we count NES Open Tournament Golf, which featured Mario as a playable character, but you know what I mean. The final reason Mario RPG still gets talked about all the time is the inaccessibility of it. Over the years, nearly all beloved Nintendo games eventually get ported or remade on modern hardware. Hell, you can play every single Zelda game on the Switch except Twilight Princess and Wind Waker, and that's because Nintendo just remade those games on their last home console. However, despite almost every Nintendo game getting shown the remake/re-release love, Mario RPG was forever trapped on the SNES. It was on the Wii and Wii U virtual consoles, but even then it was kind of just thrown on there. Nintendo didn't lay out the red carpet for it like they normally do with their tentpole releases. That was until earlier this year, when at a fateful Nintendo Direct, Nintendo showed off this. After nearly 3 decades, Nintendo was finally ready to show some love to this beloved game. Fans were through the roof. However, this announcement of a remake wasn't just exciting for fans, it was also exciting for me. I've never played the original Mario RPG despite being a massive fan of turn-based role-playing games and a massive fan of Mario. I was stoked because this remake treatment finally gave me an excuse to dip my toes into the deeply beloved waters of Super Mario RPG. So that brings us to today. After roughly 13 hours of gameplay, I've rolled credits on Super Mario RPG, and I have a lot to say about my time with the game. So let's get into it. Super Mario RPG opens with Mario entering Bowser's Keep to rescue Peach. However, while fighting Bowser, a giant sword comes crashing through the sky and into the keep, sending Mario, Peach, and Bowser flying across the kingdom. Mario soars through the sky until he conveniently crash lands into his house. After catching his bearings, Mario heads to the Mushroom Kingdom to find out what the hell happened and hopefully find his lover Peach. When he arrives at the Mushroom Kingdom, Mario runs into Mallow, a cloud-looking child that insists he's a frog. After getting drive-byed by a dinosaur named Krako, he enlists Mario's help to help retrieve his stolen goods. After recovering his stolen coins, Mallow tells you may learn more by following him to his homeland and speaking with his father, the head of the frogs, the Frog Sage. Upon talking with the Frog Sage, Mario and Mallow are informed of 3 key pieces of information. 1. Peach is no longer captive at Bowser's Keep, and she was sent flying along with Mario. 2. He informs Mario of things called star pieces that have been scattered across the kingdom due to the invasion of an evil threat named Smithy, who wants to destroy the power of wishes, represented by stars, and replace the power they hold in the world with weapons. 3. The Frog Sage informs them that Mallow is not actually a tadpole. No shit, but instead an unidentified creature who arrived in the lake one day with a note that had his name on it. Shortly after this, Mario and Mallow leave to continue the search for Peach. On the next leg of their quest, Mario and Mallow meet Geno, who is a sentient marionette puppet. He tells Mario and Mallow that he is the protector of something called the Star Road and confirms everything the Frog Sage has told them thus far. He tells Mario and Mallow that in order to repair the Star Road and reinstate the power of wishes, they must find the 7 star pieces that scattered across the world and take down Smithy once and for all. Mario and Mallow agree to help, and thus the journey begins. Shortly after this, Bowser and Peach enter the party, and your core cast of 5 party members is complete. I won't say any more about the plot specifics out of fear of spoiling anything for those like me who haven't played the game before, but needless to say, it's your standard Mario affair. Which brings me to my first disappointment with the game. Going into Super Mario RPG, I wasn't expecting crazy amounts of plot depth or deep, rich character arcs, but I was expecting a tad more than what's on display here. Given the fact that most of this game was made by the team that developed the Final Fantasy series and Chrono Trigger, I was hoping for a bit more squarification of the Mario formula. However, what's on display in Mario RPG is exactly what you would expect from your regular Nintendo Mario game. It's definitely not bad, and I don't want what I'm saying here to get misinterpreted as me saying that it is, but there's definitely not the level of character and plot depth present in other Squaresoft games of the time. However, despite not being the most complex, what is on display here is fun and charming in its own right. I particularly loved the writing of the villains. Almost every single major enemy you fight in this game says something that made me laugh out loud. There's a group of goons you fight in the latter half of the game called the Axum Rangers, and every single thing they say is just peak comedy. To put it succinctly, while there's not as much depth as I would have liked, I still think the writing of this game is just charming enough to get by. However, what's not charming enough to get by is the combat. The combat in Mario RPG is not amazing. I am a veteran of turn-based RPGs, as it's probably my favorite genre of video game. The combat of Mario RPG probably falls somewhere right in the middle in terms of quality. It's not the worst RPG I've ever played, but it's definitely not the best. There's many reasons for this, but I'll simplify it by breaking it down into three: the hybrid approach, the party balance, and a sluggish pace. Let's start with the first one. I'm someone who's always disliked the hybrid turn-based / real-time combat systems. The first time I remember encountering this style of combat was in South Park: The Stick of Truth, but since then I've seen it in countless other games. I've had varying reactions to it over the years. In South Park, I didn't love it, but the rest of the game was good enough to keep me invested. The most I've ever hated it was in Ni no Kuni, where it turned me off from the game entirely due to the free movement aspect of it. In Mario RPG, it isn't that bad, but it's still not my preferred method of combat. It basically functions the same way it does in the Stick of Truth. When being attacked or attacking, you are given a window to either hit a button and deal more or take less damage, or spam a button to deliver a more devastating attack. I find the windows for these quick time events are either too forgiving or too punishing, never striking a healthy balance. I honestly just really don't like turn-based combat systems where the damage I deal is dictated more by me hitting a button at the right time as opposed to an elemental strength or weakness. Speaking of elemental strengths and weaknesses, they exist in Mario RPG, and this segues me perfectly into my next point, which is the lack of party diversity. In order to discover an elemental strength or weakness of an enemy, you must have Mallow in your party. Unless you want a combat encounter to last upwards of 20 turns, Mallow is an absolute necessity to your party composition. He's the only character in the game that can illuminate the remaining HP and strengths and weaknesses of an enemy. Locking this ability behind one character is really silly because it instantly makes that character a must-pick for your party unless you want to dedicate countless hours to grinding in order to nullify the effectiveness of elemental damage. But if you do that, you're making the entire game baby easy and thus robbing yourself of any strategical ingenuity in battle. So, putting that aside, let's assume you have Mallow in your party. You can pick at least 2 other party members, right? Well, no. The party in Mario RPG consists of 3 characters, but Mario is a lock and cannot leave the party, and in my opinion, if you don't have Mallow in your party, you are trolling. So that only really leaves 1 rotation slot. However, once you get to that rotation slot, the diversity is plentiful. Peach, Geno, and Bowser all play vastly differently, leading to satisfying utility combos. On top of that, each party arrangement has a special unique ability called triple moves that all do very different things and can really help change the tide of a battle. For instance, if you have Mario, Peach, and Geno in a party, you get a move called Starry Shell Spike, which targets the battlefield with a star-powered shell that rains down from the sky. However, if you have Mario, Peach, and Mallow in your party, you get a move called Healing Rainbow that heals the entire party to max health. Timing one of these triple moves well can change a losing battle into a winning battle in 1 turn, and I liked that. The last thing I want to talk about regarding combat is just its sluggish pace. Any and every encounter in Mario RPG can end up lasting a long time. Throughout my time exploring the kingdoms, I had many battles with enemies that shouldn't have lasted more than a turn or 2, lasting upwards of 10. There are a few reasons for this. The first is the QuickTime events I mentioned earlier. If you miss those QuickTime events during combat, you don't get a critical hit, meaning you deal less damage. But the timing on these QuickTime events is sometimes very finicky and not always perfect, even if you're playing on a low latency display like I was. This leads to an overall lower damage output than you can achieve if you're an ultra gamer with pitch perfect reaction times. This one, I'll acknowledge, is probably a bit of a skill issue, but what's not a skill issue is the spongy ass enemies. Some of these dudes are fucking tanks. You can put ability after ability after ability into them and they won't go down, especially if you aren't targeting their weaknesses. For my first few hours in the game, I figured weaknesses must not be that relevant to the overall speed of combat encounters, since Mallow was the only one who could reveal them, but boy was I wrong. Specifically, targeting weaknesses can significantly speed up the pace of these encounters, but I still can't get over how dumb it is that Only Malo can reveal them, but at least there's a way to get around it. What there is not a way to get around is the snail slow combat animations that take absolutely forever. When an enemy goes to attack, there is a large wind-up time in order for the enemy to properly telegraph their attack to the player, so that the player can be ready to complete a quick-time event to dodge. However, this leads the speed of battle to be brought down significantly compared to any other modern turn-based RPG without this mechanic. Let's take Persona, for example. In Persona, you're given the option to fast-forward through enemy turns to speed up the pace of combat encounters. This is an important but oft overlooked aspect of these games that makes even repetitive battles fun because you're just instantly skipping to your turn, so there's very little downtime between player actions. But in Super Mario RPG, there's sometimes 30 seconds of downtime between player actions, where you are forced to just watch the enemy make the same move you've seen them make 50 times before. This sounds like a nitpick, but it's really not. Of my 13 hours of playtime, I would argue that roughly 30 minutes of it was spent just watching enemies make their moves. This combat system, in a word, is sluggish. Every aspect of it feels needlessly slow and fatiguing, and each aspect that I've broken down feeds into the other. Due to the QuickTime events, enemies need to have long windups on their attacks, and unless you're using Malo, all enemies are absolute tanks. All of these flaws spawn another, and it leads to a weird, slow, symbiotic relationship between all of these flawed systems. With the exception of diversity amongst the core cast, and the cool animations and powerful combat repercussions of triple moves, combat in Super Mario RPG Remake is a slog. What's not a slog, however, is its visual representation. Super Mario RPG is one of the best looking games on Switch, hands down in my opinion. Everything about the presentation is just gorgeous, especially on an OLED screen. Whether you're playing in handheld or on the big screen, the game looks amazing. The only issue in the presentation of it all is some really rough aliasing. Now, I'm no tech expert, but for those who don't know, aliasing is essentially when pixels are trying to form a curved line, but you can see the little diagonal rows of pixels attempting to form that curve. It's more noticeable when running at lower resolutions. I never noticed it in handheld mode or when I was playing on my big OLED TV. The only time it became an apparent issue was when I was playing on my monitor. So if you're a desk gamer, beware of playing this game while docked. That was honestly my only issue with the visuals though. There's some weird Switch hiccups here and there, such as frame rate stutters, resolution scaling, and other things we've come to expect from games on Nintendo's hybrid, but for the most part, it's well done. The colors pop, each world feels visually distinct, and the character and enemy designs are varied and full of detail. I was genuinely surprised the game was running this well on the little handheld that could, especially considering some of the disastrous releases we've seen on this console. Now I want to take a moment to talk about the moment-to-moment gameplay outside of combat. I have mixed emotions on this portion of the game. I think walking into towns in the Mario world and learning about the people living within them and just the core exploration loop of the game are awesome. I love learning more slice-of-life stuff about the world of Mario. I also really adored the writing of the NPCs. Most of them are very funny, intentionally or not, and each of them feels like they have a personality. Most only have one or two things to say, but the things they do have to say feel very worthwhile. However, I can't say the same thing about the platforming. Throughout the game, there are various platforming sections that are honestly just mind-numbing. Due to the semi-isometric camera utilized here, it's hard to anticipate where Mario is going to land, and thus jumping puzzles sometimes just feel like a shitty guessing game. Speaking of puzzles, there are a few of them in the main quest line of the game that aren't bad, but they're definitely dated. It's hard to evaluate these puzzles, since the game is 25 years old and the gaming landscape was very different back then. But I'm just going to commit to analyzing this game void of context, and if I'm doing that, I must say the puzzles are not great. Some of them are fine. There's a particular sewer environmental puzzle early on in the game that was frustrating, but I felt smart once I'd figured it out. But as the game goes on, the puzzles get more and more tedious and unnecessary, and they feel like they only exist to pad an otherwise short experience. Speaking of things that exist only to pad a short experience, let's talk about the ending section of the game. I won't be spoiling anything major as I don't feel it's necessary to do so, but if you're hypersensitive to knowing anything about it going in, you might want to click off now. The last 3 hours of the game really show the seams. Once you arrive in the final section, you are greeted with a non-stop onslaught of overly long, repetitive boss encounters that are really a sign of a different era. I understand that Arte Piazza really wanted to stay faithful to the original tenets of the game, and I respect this ambition, but when remaking any game from this era, these issues are going to come up. I mean, genuinely, there were 4 different points where I was fighting bosses and thought to myself, surely the final boss is next, right? Only to be greeted by yet another of Smithy's lackeys. This wouldn't be so bothersome if I really enjoyed the combat. I've played games that have sections like this that are really fun, so I can totally see how someone might not be bothered by this. But for me, as someone who already wasn't keen on the combat aspect of the game, I really wasn't into it, and by the 4th consecutive boss fight in a row, I was actually getting angry and feeling like my time was being disrespected. This game really shines when it takes the focus off of combat and just lets you explore the world of Mario as Mario, when it lets the characters just exist and be charming. In those smaller, quieter moments, you can really tell that this is the same team that made those original Final Fantasy games in Chrono Trigger. But in this last leg of the game, they lose sight of that a bit, and it's disappointing. I don't want to end this on a negative note, though, because I don't feel super negatively about the game as a whole. So I'm going to take a second before we close this bad boy out and rant about the soundtrack. The soundtrack for this game is easily one of the best of the year. It's up there with Persona 5 Tactica, Alan Wake 2, Starfield, and Final Fantasy 16. It takes the beautiful, iconic tracks from the original release and completely rearranges them into full orchestral arrangements, and it's fucking awesome. Firstly, the battle theme is incredible. It perfectly meets the bar for what an RPG's battle music should be, while Mario-ifying it just enough without losing the core hype vibe of the track. The theme of the star pieces is also awesome. Whenever you get a new star piece, an anthemic, saving the day type of musical piece plays that, again, just perfectly encapsulates the vibe of what's happening thematically while still retaining the Mario aspect of it all. However, I think my favorite piece of music in the whole game is the track that plays during the last cutscene. Farewell Gino / The Wishes from the Stars. This is probably my favorite musical piece from a game this year, excluding Herald of Darkness from Alan Wake 2. It's tender, heartwarming, and genuinely moving. I was tearing up as this cutscene played, and it had nothing to do with what was going on and everything to do with the beauty of the music coming out of my speakers. I mean, I was genuinely overwhelmed with emotion while listening to this piece, and it will be in my rotation of game music I listen to while driving. Honestly, I think every song from this game might end up in that rotation. The music is just that good. Even the weaker tracks like Elegy and Let's Take the Midas River work very well in the context of the game world and what's going on in the story at that time, even if they are a bit derivative of other tracks you may have heard. Overall, I feel a bit conflicted about Super Mario RPG Remake. On one hand, I think it's a perfectly enjoyable, fun little blast to the past with great art and music, but on the other, I'm still having PTSD flashbacks to the last 3 hours of fighting boss after boss after boss with stale and repetitive combat and a lack of diversity and viable playstyles. This conflict is further accentuated by Nintendo's decision to market and price this game as a tentpole release. If this game shadow dropped on the eShop for $40 like Metroid Prime Remastered did earlier this year, I would feel a lot differently about it. But seeing this game on a shelf for $60 next to countless other games this year that do far more interesting things and push the industry forward in unique ways, I struggle to wholeheartedly recommend this game. I am also somebody who really hates when their time is wasted. If I pay money for a game, I don't want filler. I'd rather have a 6-hour tight experience than a 10-hour one with 4 hours of bloat. And in all honesty, Super Mario RPG has quite a bit of bloat, which says something considering the fact that the game is only roughly 13 hours. But when I think back on my time with Super Mario RPG, I probably won't be thinking about those things. I'll be thinking about the weird NPCs I met at a seaside village. I'll be thinking about helping Mallow on his journey to find out who he is. And I'll be thinking about all of the emotions that flooded to my brain when I heard any of the vast variety of head-bobbing tracks in the game. Yes, the flaws in this game are there, and yes, they are persistent. The issues you have with this game 2 hours in will still be bothering you 10 hours in. But I think if you can get over the things I've described in this review so far, you'll have a pretty good time with Super Mario RPG. I'm going to give Super Mario RPG a 2 out of 4. Thank you so much for watching. It means the world. Again, let me know down below what you thought of Super Mario RPG. I know I'm in the minority on this one, but that's okay. All art is subjective, and that's what's fun about it. Also, I wanted to announce that this Friday, instead of seeing a review like usual, I'm going to be posting a new weekly news show called a Weekly Rundown. This will be taking the place in the consistent Friday portion of my upload schedule. Reviews will now be posted as soon as they're done. There are 2 reasons for this. One, I want to be able to get reviews for new games out faster to be closer to the buzz and popularity around them. And 2, I'm really passionate about this industry, and I want to foster a space where all people from all walks of life can come together and talk about games and everything in the industry in a respectful and welcoming way. I really hope you guys enjoy it, and I can't wait for you to see episode 1. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Thanks.